Hey everyone, I think we're now live on pmlesson.com. I'm just going to go ahead and check and verify that we're live. But in the meantime, I just wanted to let you all know that this is a PM Lesson live mock interview where we interview great PMs to do mock interview questions. And this is meant as an educational tool for all of y'all to get better at PM interviews. I'm super fortunate to be here today with Ethan, who got the job at Google. So he's going to be a Google product manager. And Ethan was in the PM Lesson course as well and used it. Ethan, would you want to go ahead and introduce yourself while I get everything set up as well?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name's Ethan. Like Steven said, I'm an incoming PM at Google. I just had my on-site and finished up the process here in these last few months. So whole interview process, PM Lesson, all very fresh in my head. Before interviewing at Google, I was a product manager at a Series B tech startup here called Cordoba. So I had some PM experience prior, but did not have much experience with this type of interviewing and kind of the things Stephen delves into in the course. So it was new for me as well, and it was a great experience. Helped me get the job.
Cool. And when do you? So you're about to start soon, right, Ethan?
Yeah, I start on the 13th of May, so got a couple weeks of fun employment here. I'm actually starting
doing these mock interviews.
Yeah, doing a couple days, helping friends wherever I can. But I'm actually going to be in the Boulder, Colorado office, so I got to move in front of me. But yeah, starting in 2 weeks.
Gotcha. Wow, that's exciting. Awesome. Okay, so now we can kind of go ahead and get started. And just for the folks listening in and watching, you're more than welcome and encouraged to participate, to interact, to like, to do all those kinds of things as we go through the interview. And we'll start off with an interview, and then I'll give some feedback at the end. And then I think Ethan might also have some good stuff and tips and other stuff to chat about at the end. And feel free to ask questions throughout. Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and get into it now. And so the question that we want to answer today is going to be a technical question. And so for those of you listening, technical PM questions are not necessarily asked at all companies, but they are asked at Google specifically. And they're, in general, something that I would recommend preparing at least somewhat for most tech companies, because if the overall rule is like, if you want to be a PM, you're probably interested in technology. So you should be able to at least converse and have a conversation about it and be able to have a deeper kind of conversation than a complete layperson would. So for this particular topic, though, it's going to be a technical PM interview question. And the question that we're asking is, how does Google Docs work? And so I will go ahead and write that up on the video. But in the meantime, Ethan, feel free to take your time, and we'll kind of work together on figuring out generally how it works. And I'm not expecting you to redesign the architecture to figure out everything, but just sort of let's talk together and figure out how some of the key components of what Google Docs does functions under the hood.
Cool. Okay, so how does Google Docs work? So I'm going to start. How does Google Docs work? Okay, I'm going to start by defining what we mean by work. So I'm going to say, I'm going to think of kind of some key pieces of Google Docs functionality and then see what we want to dive into for there. So just going to take just a minute to write some thoughts down.
Cool, take your time.
So if I'm thinking about kind of what sets Google Docs apart and what the core functionality of Google Docs would be, the first thing that comes to mind is the real-time collaborative aspect. I think there are a lot of text editors, a lot of email writers, a lot of places you can write plain text, have it saved. That's all great. But when we talk about Google Docs and kind of as we know it, I think the real-time collaboration is probably the biggest piece of functionality that jumps out to me.
Sounds reasonable.
I also think some other areas we might want to explore. Storage. I've never hit a limit on Google Docs. I know Google has some, it's either unlimited or some very high limit that they set per user kind of for their drive storage. So they must have some creative and kind of a good way of storing that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to offer that to their users. So I'm going to start with those. I'm going to start with thinking about real-time collaboration and storage. maybe a third one, I guess, would be kind of access control.
And can you clarify what you mean by access control?
Yep, absolutely. So I generally mean permissions, right? Not anyone, if I'm creating a Google Doc, not anyone from anywhere in the world can access it with a public URL, right? There are steps in place to make sure that either I'm working on it or people that I've approved are working on it. So I can see actually how access control, what I really mean by access control is permissions. Because it sounds from the words access control like I might mean who's writing what, but that I'm actually going to talk about in the real-time collaboration piece.
Cool.
So I think I think those are kind of three big pools of functionality to start thinking about. The one that I'd like to dive into first is the real-time collaboration. What do you think about that?
Sounds good. Yeah, I agree. It sounds like it's as you mentioned, like one of the main features of the product, basically. So yeah, let's start talking about how that functionality works.
Great. Okay. I don't have a whiteboard, so I'm going to be using pen and paper. Try to put it so everybody can see. So what do we mean? I guess first I want to establish the problem space. Like what do we mean when I say Google Docs facilitates real-time collaboration? So I'm going to draw a little diagram here. Okay, so what I generally mean, if you can see my screen here, is I've got two boxes drawn for clients. And what I mean here when I say real-time collaboration is that these clients, as we know, in web development, clients usually represent an end user, right? So these are essentially two people logged into Google Docs working on the same document at the same time. And we all know from using Google Docs, or if you don't, this is definitely a main tenet of Google Docs, that I can be working on a document and Stephen can be working on a document and we can both be typing at the same time and our updates don't kind of wipe each other out, right? We both get to persist our updates. So that's kind of what I want to explore here. How might that work? Well, first, what are the challenges we face in doing that and how might Google go about achieving that?
Cool, that makes sense. And thanks for the diagram. It's visible, so it works
Great.
well. Yeah.
Okay, so let's say client 1 and client 2 are both working on a document, and the document just says dog. Okay.
Okay.
So both users see the word dog on their document, and then let's say that client 1. A user goes and tries to insert an X between the O and the G. And at the same time, client 2 goes in and deletes the G. So basically, client 1 added an X, and this is what they expect to see. But at the same time, client 2 deleted the D. So this is what they expect to see. So let's say we weren't worrying about like people updating the same doc. What would happen here? Well, client 1 would basically just submit an API request, like a post request, right? And they would say, here is my new value. It's DOXG. So they would just post that. They would get the response back, and they would see DOXG. Client 2 would post OG. So client 1 would submit a post request, they would change their value and get it back. Client 2 would submit a post request, change their value, get it back. Okay, but what if they're collaborating on the same document? Okay, this is one of the problems I want us to discuss. So this is an issue of concurrency. Concurrency I'm defining here as like when two processes are trying to act on the same thing, right? Two actors, so here it's two clients, both working on the same document, both trying to update the value. What happens there, right? And so concurrency is one element that I'm going to talk about here. And the other element is updates. So again, say it's me and Stephen here. We both go update the document. How does the document deal with our concurrent updates and maintain one source of truth? And then how does it push those updates back out to us? Those are, I think, the two problems I want to approach here. How does that sound?
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so first let's talk about concurrency. So, and what I'm trying to think about here is how might Google handle this problem? So there are obviously various ways to handle both of these problems, the concurrency and the updates. One thing that comes to mind here for handling concurrency is the idea of, so we can even go back to what is the point of having a server here to navigate between these two clients? Well, the point is to maintain one single source of truth, right? And so what we're really talking about, concurrency and pushing out the updates are just problems that arise when you think about a server as being the single source of truth. So how could we go about creating that concept of kind of a single source of truth on the server? Well, in this, let's go back to this post request. So let's say, again, I'm client one, I'm trying to insert that X. That request might look something like insert an X at index 0, 1, 2. Right, so say my post request looks something like this. I want to insert an X at index 2.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I submit that request. Steven is working alongside, and he submits his delete request, which is delete a D at index 0. Okay, so now, as these come in, let's say the delete comes in first. So these essentially will be processed in a queue by the server, right? Mm-hmm. First in, first out. First action the server gets, it's going to perform on its version of the document, which is the true source of truth. So let's say it gets Steven's request first. So in its queue, it's got first a delete and then an insert. Well, when it deletes the D, then the source of truth on the server, so the source of truth on the server was DOG, then it becomes OG. Okay, so how does that change this request? Well, we are no longer inserting the X at index 2. Now we're going to insert it at index 1, right? So basically my proposal and the way I think Google handles this is by, this is a concept that I'm previously familiar with called operational transformation. And basically what this means is the server maintains its own state of the document, as we talked about source of truth. And whenever it gets requests, and those requests modify the document, the server keeps track of how the document was modified and changes its to-do list accordingly. So basically what it would do here is instead of saying insert X at 0, 2, it would say, okay, I now know that I got rid of an index to the left, so I need to insert X at index 1. And that is a concept called operational transformation. And that's how I think Google goes about, again, the concept here is as long as we have this state on the server, then we at least have kind of that one single source of truth that we're going to get out to all the clients.
Awesome. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think the core idea here is server is maintaining its own state of the document, and it's doing so using a queue.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a great explanation and really great detail. Like, love the diagram. I'm curious to push it a little further. Like, what happens when an operation can no longer be performed? Like, perhaps it was a delete, like two deletes, right? Like, I deleted DO and you deleted D. Or, there's a couple other cases where there may be cases. So you're saying we're transforming the operation into a new operation, but what happens when we can't do the operation at all?
That is a good point. So let's say we are both, okay, so you delete DO and I delete D. Yeah. Okay, give me a second to think through that one.
Sure.
So first you delete DO. The server processes that request. That is part of its state of truth. So all that's left on the server is a G. And then I go in and try to delete the D. So I think my first inclination is if it turns out to be a no operation after we process that second request, we could just invalidate it. So if you've deleted DO and I go to delete D, but we see that D is no longer there. So on deletes, I think we could end up having a no-op, right? I go to delete something, it's already gone. Inserts, I think, would be different because if I go to insert an X, there's no way that you went, I guess theoretically you could have inserted an X in the same place, but we can't tell if you intended to add the same X that I intended to add. So I think the safest way to do this would be if they're overlapping deletes, invalidate the second one. But if we both add an X at the same time in the same place, I think you have to process both and render both so that users can then determine what to see. And actually the good thing about, another thing I wanted to mention about this queuing system is it gives you almost like a history of sorts, right? So I could then see Stephen did this, Ethan did this. I could show that in a history module somewhere. I could use it for undos, Command Z, right? I could just kind of go back to the last operation. So yeah, that's my first inclination. Invalidate deletes and do a kind of superset of any inserts.
Cool. I think it's a great response. I'm curious, are there any other edge cases that we need to worry about? And then taking that question even a little bit further, like given that there are probably some weird cases, or maybe I wanted to delete only the D and I'm really shocked when the DO got deleted, how might you communicate some of these errors or potential like conflicts to the user? So the first part of that question is, are there other edge cases? The second part is, how do we communicate some of these conflicts that may emerge from these edge cases to our users? And when do we decide to do that?
Yep, great questions. Okay, so I do want to take a few seconds. Edge cases don't
take your time, of course. It's a great, to the listeners watching in while Ethan is thinking too, it's always great to pause during interview questions. It's always recommended and one of the biggest mistakes. In addition to that, if you guys are watching right now, we love it if you could like us or subscribe or just hit that like button down below. It really gives us a positive signal that these are really helpful videos and helps us encourage whether or not to make more of these and how to best spend our time. So if you're enjoying watching this video, we would really, really appreciate it for you to like and comment below.
So yeah, I'm trying to think about what other, so I think everything does boil down to either an insert or a delete. Whether you're copy pasting, bulk deleting, all these various operations still break down to an insert or a delete. So yeah, I'm actually, are there any edge cases that you were thinking of? I'm really not seeing any.
To be honest, I didn't have one in my mind. I just wanted to kind of probe you to think about it further. But the main question that I actually wanted to ask was a follow-up where it's like, let's say that we have a delete conflict or something, or something kind of goes weird where what I expected really, really was changed. Yep. When would you communicate that to the user? What tools would you offer the user to navigate sort of that? You talked a little bit about Control Z, but I'm just curious, like, what else might you think about in terms of designing that product with these technical constraints in mind?
Okay, great. So yeah, I think, so we talked about the real-time collaborative aspect, and that's what we're focused on here. So really, I'm just trying to come up with some cases that I might want to communicate to the user and see if I can kind of pull a bigger communication strategy out of that. So I like the case you offered, the kind of delete D and delete DO. So I'm going to think through that from the perspective of each user. So Stephen goes in, deletes DO. I had just deleted D on my side, or been attempting, or yes, I had just deleted D. And now what I get back is just the G. So one of the ways I think Google, it didn't occur to me immediately, but now, of course, how does Google handle this? They show you where the other users are typing, right, where their cursor is. So I would, in that case, hopefully see Stephen's cursor blinking right there. I would see, I think I'd still be a little confused, but I might get Stephen deleted the D and the O. But let's say I didn't. How would I then understand, this isn't a bug, this isn't an issue, somebody else actually deleted the D and the O? Again, I think a history of some sort, like a change log, an audit history, that updates live using some kind of server-side technology, which we can speak about in a little bit. The cursor, the live audit log, and yeah, the only other thing I can think of that you might want to communicate, or method of communicating to the user you might want to use, might be like no. So one thing you can always do when a user tries to do something and it fails is notify them, right? Error messaging, something like that. But I don't think this is a good place for that for a couple reasons. One, because it's not an error, right? It is actually collaborative editing. The fact that we couldn't process the request is an error, but from a UX perspective, we don't want to tell the user something went wrong, right? Because nothing went wrong. So that could detract in confidence in the product and all these things that we don't want when nothing went wrong. I guess we could say something like somebody already deleted what you're trying to delete. But again, I think if we do the kind of the cursor plus the audit log correctly, I don't think you want to distract. The user is primarily there to write content. So I don't think you want to distract them too much, have things pop up all over the screen. I think you want to allow them to write. And I think if we do a good enough job with those other two features, we shouldn't need a warning notification. Cool,
love it. Yeah, I think the cursor point was something that I was a little bit trying to get at there with that sort of question, which is just like, yeah, in every product, we have to consider the technical issues, but we also have to consider the UI elements that can help operate around those technical constraints and help like clarify, communicate to the user. So it's great you picked that up on your own.
And one thing I would like to do here, I just add, whenever I'm juggling kind of a technical challenge, oftentimes technical challenges seem a lot worse on the back end than they are to the user. So this is definitely the sort of thing I would love to experiment with, see users with it hands-on, see if there actually is any friction there and if there is a problem to solve, because if not, we won't solve it.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like, I mean, what we're talking about is technically a very small case where like you and I are maybe editing at the same time and we happen to be editing the same word. Like it definitely happens at the scale Google Docs is operating at, but if we were starting Google Docs from scratch, I'm not sure that we would worry about that feature so much in the very beginning, or maybe we would find another way to operate around that technical constraint that's like much easier and we don't have to worry about it. Cool. Well, I do want to touch on, so this is great. I do want to touch on the other two topics you mentioned about storage and permissions and just maybe briefly go through them. Maybe we can spend about 5 to 10 more minutes on this part. And then we can kind of do the feedback and wrap up and have the tips at the end. Sound okay?
Sounds great. Okay, so for storage, I'm just going to kind of hit some highlights of things I think Google Docs does and why I think it might go about doing it that way.
Cool.
So first of all, in terms of storage, first thing I want to think about is like, what do we have to store, right? Almost an informal DB schema. So we definitely have to store, for each record, let's say, for each document as a record, we've got like a user ID, all the unique identifier. We've got, but the part I really want to get to is the content. So I'm going to kind of skip the other columns. How do we store the content? So my first thought would be plain text, right? It's words. At the end of the day, that's what a user's writing. Words, text, that's what they care about. But as soon as I jump into Google Docs and play with it, I start to realize there's also formatting, right? And Google definitely preserves formatting, right? If you bold something, you leave the page, you come back to the page, it's still bolded. So they are persisting that beyond in memory. They're persisting it in persistent storage somewhere. So my thought would be probably to use Markdown to store. I think there are many different ways you could retain knowledge of this formatting and these sort of metadata pieces about the text, but I think Markdown would be the best one. Just think about what Google offers. Bolding, italics, underlining, those are generally covered by Markdown. So I think you could kind of have a column which is the text plus the Markdown, and then you can basically serve that column as a Markdown document in the browser to the user. Another thing I want to say with respect to storage is I do think this data. I'm not going to go so far as to take a stance on if we should use a normalized or denormalized database. I do think this data is relatively denormalized. There aren't, and what I mean when I say that, there aren't a bunch of joins and linking tables we're going to have to do to get kind of the logical data that we want altogether. So I think we could go with kind of a document-based storage, which tends to be more performant at scale, fetch that data more quickly, et cetera. I think the only other thing, maybe we'd want to store some sort of file structure, so we remember folders, files, that sort of thing. But yeah, it'll essentially be marked down with some sort of file path metadata.
Cool. And yeah, keep going if you wanted to keep at it more.
That was kind of. Is there anything else you wanted me to touch on with storage?
No, I think it's good. I think I'll give you feedback at the end about that one. I thought it was great. Short analysis, given like we're trying to be a little brief, so that was great. Yeah.
Cool. And then the last one, access control and permissions. I'll kind of talk about how I was going to approach this one in the interview at the end as well. But I think what you're trying to do here is essentially another column in that database is something like what users have access to this, right? So I invite Steven. When I invite Steven, we go record his ID in a column of the database that says, yes, this user can access this document. And maybe you even have another column for permission level, view, suggest, edit. But yeah, again, I think that kind of goes to storage. We don't need to create some huge users table that we link to. I think we could do this through a denormalized data set, just putting it in another column.
Cool. All right. I don't have any further questions for you about that question. So I'd love to kick it to feedback so we can fit in also your general tips at the end too.
Yeah.
I overall thought this was like a phenomenal answer, and you clearly know your stuff. So really, really great job. Shows how you got that Google PM interview. So overall, like really great congratulations on this interview and everything. I wanted to comment on some of the things that I thought you did really well. And throughout that, it'll also comment on opportunities and improvements as well. Yeah. And for those listening in and watching, this is a good time for you to comment, ask further questions. We'll do a little bit of Q&A too, so feel free to chime in there. And we'd love to kind of hear from you as well. So the diagram was amazing. So that was a really, really great visual way to explain what was in your mind. And one huge error for a lot of people is that they don't use the whiteboard. And this clearly begged for the whiteboard too. So I'm really glad that, like, despite this video chat stuff, you've like held up the paper too. Yes. So, and I think that just made your answers so much more clear and crisp. And one thing that I liked about using that example is that you made it very personable. So you were just like you and me, like we're the two people and we're using the word dog, right? So you're not talking in the abstract, you're using concrete, clear examples with visual cues to identify and communicate to the interviewer what's in your brain. Because part of the whole problem is communicating what's up in here to the interviewer. The fact that you paused was really great. I love that you even started off the whole interview by defining what work means. So like we're kind of starting off the definitions of like, so how does Google Docs work? Or like, how does this whole thing function? Is that what we're trying to answer? And kind of checking with me. Yep. I think you could have asked me more follow-up questions about that too. So, you could have, instead of assuming, you could have even taken the time to be like, oh, so what do you mean by that? Like what aspects of Google Docs are important? And I know you did ask that to me at one point. But just, I always really encourage like asking as many questions up front as possible.
Yep.
I love that you handled the follow-up questions really well, and you really did a good job of kind of thinking through the user perspective. I remember there was one point where you weren't sure how to answer something, and you did a really, really good tactic that I encourage to all you listening to do as well, which is like, okay, let me think. So if I'm sitting here and I type in DOG, and I get this back, and you're kind of walking through your thought process with the interviewer, that is like super, super good and super skilled. And so that sort of explaining your brain to the interviewer and really thinking from the user perspective is a really great way to think as just a PM in general. Another couple comments I had was that I loved that you talked about the UI aspect of it. I think we could have brought that in a little bit earlier. So I know I prompted you for it, but it's interesting because PM technical questions are never truly just technical. Like what they're really assessing is how can you operate, understand, and deal with technical constraints in a way that can relate to the product overall. So adding a cursor is like a really simple thing that adds a lot of safety to the user in terms of knowing what's going on. There's version history, there's error messages, which you mentioned also. You eventually mentioned a lot of these things, but these little cues really do matter. And it's really cool to talk about them in PM interviews because they're sort of inspired by the technical feasibility issues that we might have with version control. Also thought that I think bringing up edge cases on your own is also just makes it really strong too. So that's just further on that point. And then on the last section, just the last piece of feedback, I thought you did an excellent job of kind of discussing trade-offs. And I loved, especially with the markdown part, you started like the naive approach is to do plain text. And then what do we like, okay, so, does plain text work? Okay, no, we need these things. So then what do we add to it, right? And I thought that was just a super excellent way to kind of walk the interviewer along with you. And I think that was something you're really, really good at. So overall, like super positive feedback. This is a stellar interview.
Thank you.
So yeah, just wanted to congratulate you. And do you have any reactions or thoughts sending that feedback?
Yeah, I do. So one thing I've actually noticed about myself in these interviews, interestingly, like if I get a question and I feel like I know it, or I feel like I know how I want to go about approaching it, I almost have more difficulty structuring my answer because you want to get to like what you know so quickly, right? So I think that's one of the reasons I think I skipped over some of the clarifying questions here. I almost moved too quickly when I know where I want to go from the start. So that's one thing I'd say to the viewers is, if you, and this is one thing I want to talk about a little later, if you ask a question and you feel like you know where you want to go, you've got an advantage, right? Like you're kind of winning already at the interview. So you kind of want to hold on to that and make sure you pace it right and don't jump into something that maybe they didn't even want to hear about.
That's a really good tip. Yeah.
So that's my first kind of reaction. And then my second reaction was another thing I wanted to bring up. Like I almost, when I defined the kind of things that I thought we might want to talk about, real-time collaboration, storage, access control, I did so kind of knowing that I was going to be stronger in the first two than the third. So, that was kind of, I intentionally used most of the time talking about real-time collab because I think, this is one of, and then I'll just kind of dive straight into my tips.
Sure.
Of them.
And maybe we can cue it off just so that
Sure.
we can separate the video. But and so now, I just want to let everyone know that we're now going to kind of transition a bit into, we just did this awesome mock interview with Ethan where he answered how Google Docs works. And now we're really excited to have Ethan talk and share a little bit about his tips for interview